Hello. First of all, thanks everyone for inviting us here to share our research. This is a really exciting opportunity to talk about risks and challenges and opportunities for the governments, for countries, but also for the private sector when tackling the climate crisis. So my intervention can be broken down into a couple of parts. The first part, I'll talk about the latest IPCC report, but the majority of my talk will be looking at case studies, looking at countries and actual action happening on the ground. So, to start with, in 2015, as I'm sure you all know, the Paris Climate Change Accord was adopted. And at that meeting, the IPCC was invited to prepare a special report to assess the impacts and the related pathways to a 1.5 degree warming. This was done, and the report was released in October of 2018. So at COP24, for those of you who don't know, that's the Conference of Parties for the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. These parties unfortunately couldn't agree to come to a consensus to put at the heart of the negotiations this new IPCC report. However, the report was adopted in October previously. Hoosung Lee, the chair, pictured here, of the IPCC, he basically had the big takeaway, didn't he, in COP24, that the world has 12 years, now less, to address the climate challenge in order to avoid a climate catastrophe. That was basically the headlines the next day. So I had a few takeaways from the report. The first is that it's not all bad news. It is possible for us to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. It's not going to be easy, but it is possible. However, it's going to require incredible structural changes on our part. The business as usual model we've been carrying on with cannot continue, and if we do carry on with, we're going to be forced to change anyway. The second takeaway is that every little bit counts. Success by half a degree. The report looked at the difference between a warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees and above. Basically, sometimes it can seem like this is not much of a difference. However, it can mean the difference between survival of coral reefs, of crops, and of species. In terms of sea level rise, for example, which I'll be talking about in a bit, the limiting of a warming to 1.5 might limit the sea level rise, which could affect more than 10 million people that live on coastal cities and islands. The fourth was a bit of a surprise to me, and that was technologies. For over 10 years, in the negotiations, we've been putting our hopes on these as yet to be invented technologies that are going to save us. But according to this report, these technologies already exist. It's not going to be easy. The carbon will have to be sucked out of the air by machines and stored underground, but apparently these devices exist. And finally, the last takeaway is individual action. Each and every one of us needs to make a difference. The report's authors say that rapid change must take place in 4 key parts of society. That would be energy generation, land use, cities, and industry. Of course, we need world leaders to make stronger commitments to guarantee the healthy future of the life of the planet, but it will also come down to behavioral patterns. How we consume energy, how we eat, how we live will make a difference. And this all has to come in conjunction with the number 3 part that I skipped over, which is multiple actions. Of course, we know that emissions have to be cut. That is the majority of the report is what it's saying. But in concert with that, in addition with that, alongside that, we need to have structural behavioral changes in society. But it's not all doom and gloom. However, time is running out. The first IPCC report was put out in 1988, so we've wasted a lot of time. So now that I've gotten the good news out of the way, let's look at some country examples. So basically, some countries will feel the effects of climate change more acutely than others. Some other countries are in real danger of disappearing altogether. Small island states, for example, are at particular risk of climate change, and the reasons are threefold. The first is geographical realities of the SIDS, or the small island developing states. The size and position of these countries means that as sea levels rise, their land literally disappears. The second is as extreme weather events proliferate around the world, many of these islands are in the pathways of hurricanes and typhoons. And the third is that the islands are not all small geographically in size, but also economically less powerful than most of the countries. They face similar economic and sustainability challenges, such as elevated transport costs, growing populations, unsustainable use of available natural resources, and with smaller populations who are often reliant on single-source markets, their ability to adapt to climate change or to rebuild after extreme weather events is limited. So on that, let's look at sea level rise. This is of a major concern, obviously, for island states, none more so than the Pacific island nation of Kiribati, whose 100,000 inhabitants could be the first people to see their country disappear within a generation. Contributing to less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the entire 51 countries put together, these island states are at the forefront of advocating for climate action by the larger emitters. For these islands, climate change is both an issue of security and also survival. In the case of Kiribati, the former president Anote Tong stated that they may already have reached the point of no return, adding that to plan for the day that you no longer have a country is indeed painful, but I think we have to do that. This brings up the very sensitive subject of the climate refugee. What becomes of a people whose country has disappeared due to due to climate change? The only option left for these island states is to migrate overseas and claim refugee status, a status that lacks official definition in the lexicon today. In an interview I had with Sione Fulave, he was basically in Tonga's Ministry of Climate Change. I think he said it very poetically. For Pacific Islands, cultures are tied to the land and the sea. Our ancient myths, legends, our origins are all based on stories and oral traditions from the land, earth, and sky. Our identity is based on where we are from. In other words, they don't want to leave their land. So this term, climate refugee, is highly politicized, being used by some to use these as basically the face of the climate crisis. But these islanders don't want to be the face of the climate crisis. The concept is rejected by many of them. They are looking for solutions through self-determination and action, rather than planning for mass displacement of entire populations. For island states, mitigation is what is needed, not migration. But this, of course, needs to be done by the larger emitters. So then, if we move on to the proliferation of extreme weather events, we only have to look at what happened last Thursday. 100,000 people in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe are suffering the effects of Cyclone Idai. Mozambique declared a state of emergency. The cyclone wasn't even a cyclone when it first touched base. It hit Mozambique as a tropical storm, went back up to sea, gathered force, and then pummeled it. Floodwaters, because of raining and the cyclone itself, are still rising. Today, thousands of people have been displaced. The death toll is over 1,000. We don't know. The entire city of Beira has been destroyed. Island states as well are particularly susceptible to large ocean atmospheric events such as El Nino, but also these events such as hurricanes and typhoons. Again, we only have to look at what happened in 2017, which is a particularly devastating year for the Caribbean. In September of 2017, Hurricane Irma made landfall in the island of Barbuda. The Category 5 hurricane was 378 miles wide when it destroyed the 62 square mile island. Only 2 days later, fearing that Hurricane Jose would be of similar strength, the entire island was evacuated. Later that same month, Hurricane Maria devastated neighboring Dominica, turning a country with a promising ecotourism sector into rubble overnight, with only over 95% of the buildings destroyed or damaged. Many of the Dominicans fled, some of them permanently. This same hurricane, Hurricane Maria, also hit Puerto Rico. I'm sure you've heard about that, demolishing trees and buildings. According to Amnesty International, a year after the hurricane, there were still tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans living under blue tarps. The George Washington study that was put out last year raised the death toll to an estimated 2,975 from the original 64 that was reported during the hurricane. And the point is that these cyclones and these hurricanes are getting stronger. Again, if we go back to the Pacific Islands, we are only now getting to grips with the data we have available of the understanding what sea level rise and these extreme weather events means for these small Pacific atolls. In February 2018, a Category 5 cyclone, Cyclone Gita, made landfall in Tonga. During this time, discussions were taking place to recategorize actual cyclone strength to include a Category 6, which currently doesn't exist, because the winds of Hurricane Gita were over 250 kilometers per hour. Okay, and now we look at, if we come now to Africa, similar to the small island developing states, it is widely recognized that the African continent will be hit faster and with a higher magnitude by a changing climate than many other parts of the world. It is projected that in many countries, temperature increases will be several degrees higher than the global average. Just because we have a 1.5 global warming does not mean that it's going to be that uniformly, obviously around the world. In many parts of Africa, it's already past that. Some projecting that it will reach up to a 6-degree warming. So throughout the continent, climate-related impacts such as droughts, failing crops, unpredictable weather patterns, and rising temperatures in lakes have escalated in recent years. The resulting economic instability and food insecurity have been linked to large-scale migration and displacement of communities, and conflict over remaining resources. Poverty and vulnerability go hand in hand. Without the correct tools, including technology, skills, infrastructure, it is more difficult for communities to tackle climate change. And Africa is already suffering. I already mentioned the last week's cyclone Idai. In 2008, if we stick to poor Mozambique, the Zambezi River flooded, displacing 1 million people. There has been increases in temperature surface waters in the Great African Lakes, the retreat of tropical highland glaciers in East Africa, soil moisture drought and tree density decrease in the Western Sahel, a shift in the range of plants and animals, and a degradation of the coral reefs around Africa. In recent years, Africa has made great gains in development. In the past decade and a half, the economic growth on the continent has increased. But if the climate crisis is not managed correctly, these gains will be for nothing. So this brings us to the climate change, border migration, and internally displaced people. The image of people attempting to cross the Mediterranean to reach European shores has been etched into the European psyche in recent years. However, in Africa, the reality is that population movements occur much more frequently within country. The idea of the internally displaced person is much more pressing. Historically, migration has been used by people for various reasons, from searching for alternative food sources to escaping conflict zones. In 2019, climate change is the underlying factor in human movement. Violence and economic instability is the result. An increase in demand for land combined with shrinking resources is causing conflict. You have people from, for example, in the Fulanis in the northern Nigeria that have had to move further south for grazing pastures, in which case they're coming into contact and in conflict with communities of existing farmland. I won't have time to go through the entire of Nigeria. However, this whole presentation is based on this paper that I'm having coming out in the next couple of weeks. So if you are interested in it, I can go into further detail, or I can send it to you. So just quickly, within Nigeria, with a population of 177 million, Nigeria is not only the most populous country in the continent, is the most populous country in OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So despite attempts to diversify away from oil production, Nigeria remains economically reliant on oil and gas industry. However, the recent recession was largely due to the result of declining global oil prices, which is exacerbated by the decrease in oil production because of intensified violence in the Niger Delta. And this is the anomaly with the Niger Delta. Despite the importance of the Niger Delta in oil production, it is the very oil exploration that has resulted in environmental degradation and pollution, bringing about social, political, health, and economic insecurity in the region. In addition to this, as I mentioned before, the movements of people has escalated across Africa. Herders from large nomadic communities have moving their livestock into the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, putting them in direct contact with farmers and other communities. In between 2014 and 2018, approximately 5,000 deaths occurred as a result of these clashes. So finally, I'd like to look very quickly at climate change as a threat multiplier. Climate change can accentuate situations of distress relating to scarcity of natural resources or conflict situations by amplifying the problems. This includes mass movements of people, as I've mentioned, which can be partially attributed to climactic circumstances creating pressure points that have moved people towards cities, towards borders. In 2017, while we were all going to COP23 in Bonn, the first COP that the US would not be fully involved in, as in it was the first COP after President Trump had decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. In the US itself, at that same time, the US House and Senate Armed Services Committee were finishing their own negotiations. In the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2018, then US Secretary of Defense James Mattis stated, "I agree with the effects of climate change, such as an increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others. They impact our security situation." And this was not the first time that the US recognized climate change as a threat multiplier. It was way back in 2003, which granted is not that long ago, the Pentagon commissioned a study entitled An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implications for United States Security. This report linked food shortages, declining fresh water, and disrupted energy access to the destabilization of regional and world order. It notes that countries such as India, South Africa, and Indonesia are already experiencing conflict, and climate change has the potential to destabilize an already volatile situation. Although at the time this report was deemed too sensitive or controversial for the US, it does suggest that at least the DoD has been aware of the need to include climate change in its security plans. And since that moment, there have been further studies put out. In addition to that, both the UK government and the EU have also linked climate change to their security plans. So finally, that is final. It's not just for developing countries. Obviously, I've been talking a lot about these countries that need a lot more assistance, but it is also affecting. Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in 2017. The flooding up in the UK, for example. The Arctic as well has experienced some of the most rapid changes on Earth, almost twice the global average. These, again, could potentially bring clashes between environmental and security concerns with the geopolitics in the region. So to conclude, I hope I've made the case and demonstrated that the socioeconomic and cultural impact is already being felt in very different corners of the globe. The warnings of the latest IPCC should be enough for us to galvanize action. However, how can we move forward? And this is where you guys can come in. All of these issues need to be addressed by a combined work of governments, communities, and the private sector. Countries need to focus on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this business as usual model that we have been using is no longer viable. We are going to have to change our habits in one way or another. What is needed now is strong, innovative strategies that maximize local and international knowledge to address climate change adaptation and mitigation techniques. One of the mechanisms out of the Paris Agreement, or several mechanisms that go alongside the Paris Agreement, is to provide funding to developing countries to put in place these projects. If Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, what we can learn, if anything, from that at the moment is that we need to plan better. We need better financing, and we need to put in place infrastructure. What is needed is a concerted effort by the donor community and governments. What is needed is combined efforts between researchers, experts, policymakers to build projects that work. We need to speed up investment, and this investment needs to be on resilient projects. And that's the key for many of these countries. We need to build capacity in these countries so they can move from a situation of reliance to one of resilience. And the last thing I'll finally leave you with is, as a global community, we need to move from a situation where we are always reacting to natural disasters and climactic events to a situation where we can be proactive in putting in place policies and projects that can curb the worst of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to Beasley and to Minas Associates for hosting this event today, and thank you for coming. I'd particularly like to thank Charles for inviting and looking after us today. On 29th of September 2015, Mark Carney delivered a groundbreaking speech here at Lloyd's of London, in which he delivered a powerful and simple message. Climate change is an unprecedented risk to the financial sector and systemic financial stability. It was a message that I'm sure the financial world was not expecting from a governor of a central bank. That evening, Mr. Carney explained how financial risks from climate change come from two main channels. The first being physical risk caused by extreme weather, aptly illustrated in Simon's presentation. Series of floods or hurricanes or widespread droughts can all result in large financial losses, reduced asset value and creditworthiness of borrowers. They also have the potential to overwhelm the ability of insurance markets to absorb those losses. The second risk that he identified is called transition risk. It's caused by a process of adjustment towards a low-carbon economy. Particularly, regulators and policymakers might suddenly enact drastic measures, and the longer the delay in sufficient action to limit global warming, the more likely that's becoming. As you know, political or regulatory risk is the hardest risk to price due to its unpredictability. The second aspect of transition risk is sudden asset repricing, leading to the collapse in value of entire industrial sectors, and we are seeing that right now in the US with the coal sector. And there's a third risk factor, and that is liability risk. This relates to litigation and claims against companies for failure to mitigate, failure to adapt to climate risks, or to disclose climate-related financial information. The economist Paul Fisher has gone further to explain how climate change could directly cause the next financial crisis. This is based on the premise that those risks could cause systemically important institutions, banks, insurers, large institutional investors, to face insolvency. So now the message is clear. Climate change is a material financial risk. It is no longer a peripheral ESG issue. On the night of his Lloyd's speech, Mark Carney described a looming tragedy of the horizon, whereby short-term imperatives of quarterly returns, annual bonuses, and even election cycles are out of sync with the medium to long-term catastrophic impacts of climate change on economies, biodiversity, and human lives. In Carney's words, climate change imposes a risk on future generations that the current one has no direct incentive to fix. But even in the short 4 years since that speech, we're seeing time horizons move ever more closely together. Indeed, I can tell you that all three risks, physical, transition, and liability, are manifesting in myriad ways and gaining momentum. So today I'm going to walk you through those risks and hint also at the opportunities, just as important, created by climate change, using some specific examples of how countries and regulators are responding. And my focus is going to be on legal and regulatory options and innovations in the green finance space. That's what I do. And in my view, these dimensions are simply not talked about enough. I happen to know that law and regulation are often viewed by you financial and corporate types as getting in the way. Indeed, I've been told that law in particular is regarded much as an undertaker would be, to be called upon only at the end of a very long process and then only if absolutely necessary. Law rarely gets invited to the parties. But today I'm going to present to you the facilitative or lubricative role of law and regulation in this space, and I'm going to say to you that this is a good thing. Robust and transparent domestic legal frameworks can be just as important as policy for tempering risks and encouraging investor confidence. And in so doing, it can enable finance to flow at the necessary scale to deal with climate change. The OECD has estimated that to address climate change, about $95 trillion will need to be invested globally by 2030 in infrastructures such as energy, transportation, water, and telecommunications. At least 60% of that investment will need to occur in developing countries and emerging economies. Yet public monies currently available for this purpose fall extremely short. For example, only $5 billion thus far has been committed by developed countries for the benefit of developing countries through the Green Climate Fund pursuant to the Paris Agreement. So, conceptions of climate or green finance must now include private capital. Indeed, it's fast becoming accepted that the private sector, especially the finance sector, has a critical role beyond just surviving climate risks to actually helping the shift to a low-carbon and more resilient global economy. So a key question for regulators is how best to engage the private sector, and the key question for the private sector is what's in it for us. And there are two main ways to address these questions. The first is bringing home the risks, and the second is emphasising the opportunities. Using both of those risk and opportunity lenses, I conducted a study recently for UN Environment that analysed international case studies to see how countries are beginning to respond. By investigating which regulatory approaches have been successful and also unsuccessful, that research analysed legal context implications for climate finance. And the result was development of a legal analytical framework to identify, make explicit a rainbow of regulatory options and legal forms from which lawmakers and regulators can choose when seeking to mobilise climate finance. So let me walk you through what was found. First, the regulatory options that are beginning to be taken, and second, their legal forms. So first, data analyses revealed a twofold typology of regulatory options, which I think rather catchily classified as financial mechanisms and facilitative modalities. Importantly, what I found is that both types of regulatory option are essential and complementary for engaging the private sector and mobilising and leveraging climate finance. Financial mechanisms, as you can see, are hard financial instruments that directly mobilise or leverage private finance. They have a dollar sign in front of them. Emphasis is often placed on a carbon price by economists in this category, but that alone is insufficient to encourage investment at the scale required and to change behaviour within the short time frame available to us. So you can see the additional financial instruments are being deployed to incentivise private investment in renewables, clean tech, energy storage and resilience building initiatives around the world. By contrast, facilitative modalities are soft, often informational initiatives, and they indirectly mobilise finance by enhancing project pipeline, capacity building and knowledge transfer. And they are dynamic. So, for example, to this suite of facilitative modalities that I have here in purple, we can now add green taxonomies, such as that being developed in the EU. Most of you will be familiar with the financial mechanisms, but the facilitative modalities are quite a revelation. These enabling instruments have never been considered as ingredients of climate or green finance before, but this research shows so clearly that they are. They fuel awareness, cultural change, project pipeline and capacity building. They are as fundamental to getting climate finance flowing at scale as the financial mechanisms. The other benefit, and one that's quite attractive to governments, is that they tend to be cheap relative to, say, blended finance to set up and run. The second key finding from the data was that these options are manifesting in a variety of legal forms. So for the financial mechanisms, we see legislative interventions might be general legislation such as the Mexican General Law on Climate Change of 2012. Could be sectoral legislation such as a carbon or coal price in tax legislation, the latter of which was enacted in India's Finance Act of 2010. Or bespoke legislation such as the creation of a green investment or a climate trust fund, and these are often a venue for blended finance, as seen in Kenya's climate fund. And we also see contractual arrangements for green bonds and also insurance. In contrast, the legal forms of facilitative modalities are more varied. Some have no legal form at all, relying instead on coalitions and collaborations. And examples of those include matchmaking and training schemes like those occurring through the Climate Finance Accelerator, convened by the UK government and PwC in case countries such as Nigeria and Morocco, and ideas labs such as the India Innovation Lab for Green Finance that develop innovative financial instruments to leverage private finance. In such cases, supportive policy environments are really desirable to legitimate and enable the formation of these modalities. Nonetheless, facilitative modalities can also take legal forms. In legislation, we see them in the form of directors' duties for financial reporting, and we'll see them in the forthcoming EU green taxonomy legislation as well. We see contractual legal arrangements exemplified by public-private NGO partnerships, such as the Zurich Insurance Flood Resilience Partnership. And we also see them in financial and market regulation, including what we call soft law reporting, such as the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, the TCFD, stock exchange listing rules for green bonds, or guidelines for climate risk assessment issued by central banks and supervisors. And indeed, it's this last category of financial market regulation that I want to focus on as an example of regulatory innovation and momentum in this particular space. Since 2015, stimulated by the leadership of the Bank of England, central banks around the world have started paying attention to climate risk, with early movers including France, the Netherlands, China, and England. Similarly, securities and financial markets regulators are beginning to step up focus on climate risk disclosure and to increasingly engage with firms. Early movers include the French and Dutch financial market authorities, the UK Financial Conduct Authority, the California Department of Insurance, and the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority. These regulators are pushing a few things. Firstly, stress tests and scenario analyses for banks, insurers, and financial service providers. Secondly, enhanced disclosure on climate risks and forward-looking business plans as per the TCFD recommendations. And even, in the case of the Californian Insurance Commissioner last year, divestment of fossil fuel assets by regulated firms. Importantly, we are beginning already to see roll-on effects of these regulatory moves. For example, on investor and shareholder expectations shown recently in the case of Exxon. And we're also seeing it in terms of increasing legal liability. For example, Client Earth, a prominent UK-based legal NGO, recently submitted claims to the UK Financial Reporting Council and also clarificatory requests to the Big Four auditing firms on the alleged basis that annual reports from certain firms were deficient on the issue of climate risks and therefore in breach of current reporting requirements under the UK Companies Act. Naturally, a key question being asked is why financial regulators are introducing climate-related initiatives, given their mandate is to promote the safety and soundness of regulated firms. Leading central banks such as Banque de France, Bank of England, and the People's Bank of China are taking a forward-looking supervisory approach that assesses firms not just against current risks, but also plausible future risks. And it is here that climate change becomes relevant to the supervisor's job. As I emphasised earlier, climate change has been identified as a material, foreseeable financial risk that needs to be addressed by the finance sector today to prevent or minimise the harshest impacts on that sector and hence the market in the future. So, as stated recently by Sarah Breeden of the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and I quote, "It is in the financial sector's own interests to minimise those risks, and those risks are minimised with an early, orderly transition. I'm not asking them to hug a tree, but to manage their financial risk." Yet a recent PRA survey of 90% of the UK banking sector, representing over £11 trillion in assets, found that only 10% of respondent banks are taking a strategic board-level approach to identify and measure long-term financial risks posed by climate change. This means that the vast majority of firms are not yet supporting an orderly transition. So not surprisingly, central banks around the globe are increasingly regarding the identification of climate risk and the actions required to address it as a necessary part of their obligation to ensure financial stability. To some extent, this could all be seen as an advanced economy phenomenon, but one thing these financial regulators are now doing is banding together and forming international voluntary networks through which to help each other develop climate risk management in the finance sector, to mainstream green finance generally, and to share best practices and learnings, and assumedly for potential replication across jurisdictions. For central banks, that has taken the form of the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. Formed in late 2017, it's rapidly expanding to 30 members and observers globally, including central banks of Mexico, Morocco, and Thailand. In addition, the IFC now convenes the Sustainable Banking Network, which is a community of financial regulators and banking associations in emerging markets committed to similar goals. There is no doubt that this is a really new area. It's literally unfolding as we speak. We held a roundtable on these issues at King's College London in January this year, to which we invited a blend of public, private, legal, financial and developed and developing country representatives. And it was quite clear from discussions that this is a steep learning curve for both regulators and market participants. There are questions arising around TCFD uptake, how to do scenario analysis, and harmonisation of standards. But it is also clear that this is the direction in which we are all moving. The informed prediction is that regulators in emerging economies will adopt similar approaches to those of the early movers. So let me bring this all back in. Countries around the world, including developing countries, emerging economies, are starting to make changes to legal and regulatory frameworks, not just policy, in relation to climate change and climate finance particularly. The aim of these changes is to directly and indirectly increase attention to climate risk and more effectively engage private capital to address climate change. And there are two main ways that they're doing this. The first, they can make standalone changes, such as amendments to taxation acts or companies acts, or they can take and are taking an integrated regulatory approach. And this particular approach essentially means mixing the financial mechanisms and the facilitative modalities to account for climate risks, to create climate-related opportunities, and to enable greater flows of climate finance. The choice is going to depend on country context, but the data show that to be most effective, an integrated approach is more likely to help ensure a stable environment for investment. This table and the one that follows summarises the climate-related legal, regulatory and policy initiatives in Mexico and Kenya using the legal analytical framework to see strengths and also gaps. We held another roundtable at King's College London last year, and that one was purely for the public sector. In that roundtable, we discussed these case studies, Mexico and Kenya, to see what other emerging economies could learn from their experiences. And a key finding from those discussions was that both countries had experienced obstacles to fully engaging the private sector. In Kenya, for example, part of this is due to an inherent infrastructure deficit and lack of available local finance due to insufficient incentives and capacity. Nonetheless, Kenya is now focused on creating opportunities, including, for example, a potential $8.5 billion investment opportunity in recycling, infrastructure and waste management. There's interest in this country about green bonds and how sukuk instruments could attract international investors, as demonstrated by Nigeria and Malaysia, and how deals could be aggregated to attract international and multilateral development finance. Kenya has also recently established a new entity, the Nairobi International Financial Centre, to work with Treasury. It's described as a virtual special economic zone aimed at improving the business and legal environment in order to attract financial services from developed countries into Kenya. So in conclusion, I hope to have given you a better glimpse into the way the world is moving in this area. There's no doubt change is happening, but the question is whether it's happening quickly enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and Carney's tripartite risks. With this in mind, actually, a recent UNPRI report has focused on the likelihood of inevitable frenetic policy activity, at which point options and innovations close down, potential for collaborations close down, and we're in the panic room. Yet we see efforts by central banks and financial regulators such as the Prudential Regulatory Authority, lawmakers and treasury such as those in Kenya, and litigators such as Client Earth working to ensure this doesn't happen. Importantly, incredible opportunities are also being created at this time. These opportunities include project and product innovation, access to new market and reputational enhancement for the private sector. Importantly, and more than that, they also include helping to build capacity for empowerment, resilience, and financial autonomy in developing countries. We really are creating the future right here, right now, in the present. It's exciting, it's scary, and it's definitely all hands on deck. So invite the lawyers to your parties. Thank you.